Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the resource webinar on innovation in corporate renewable PPAs. My name is Bruce Douglas. I'm the coordinator of the resource platform. We have over 250 participants registered for the webinar, so a lot of interest in this topic, and we're delighted to have on the call this afternoon one of our partners and two of the leading experts in the world to cover the topic of innovation in corporate renewable PPAs. First of all, just a quick note of information. We will be taking questions during the broadcast. Thank you. Please do feel free to post your questions in the control panel using the question block there. Press send. We'll be selecting some of those to put to our presenters during the session. The agenda for today, I will first make an introduction to the resource platform, then pass to Lucy Hunt, Renewable Energy Associate of WBCSD, to talk about accelerating PPAs, then to Andrew Hedges, partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, to talk about types, risks, and common approaches, and finally, a lender's perspective from Mariella de Vries, Vice President Project Finance in Rabobank. First of all, the resource platform. What is the resource platform? It was founded 2 years ago by 4 founding associations you see there in the top right: Solar Power Europe and Wind Europe from the energy supply side, RE100 and the Climate Group on the buy side, and WBCSD representing both buyers and suppliers. So you see the platform is an alliance of all the stakeholders active in Europe in the corporate renewable energy sourcing space, and the aim is to try and connect both buyers and suppliers. Here you see listed is the objectives of the resource platform. So primarily it's to influence EU and national policymakers to accelerate corporate sourcing. Secondly, to raise awareness and educate stakeholders about the advantages of corporate renewable sourcing. And finally, to provide business opportunities connecting the buyers and suppliers. And our motto is to move from 100 buyers to 100,000. So to accelerate the uptake of corporate renewable sourcing from the 100 active buyers currently procuring renewables to the 100,000 that we see as the potential. The hashtag, if you want to use it whilst listening or in the future, is hashtag 100 to 100K. These are some of the stakeholders who are active in the platform. First of all, the steering committee there at the top, representing some of the largest buyers and suppliers in Europe, supported by the European Commission and IRENA. The data is supplied by Bloomberg, and at the bottom there you see some of our association partners representing some of the sectors, including the chemical industry sector, the Federation of Energy Traders, utility sector, and the guarantees of origin certificate bodies. On this screen, you see the buyers, just a snapshot of some of the buyers who were represented at the recent resource event at the end of November in Amsterdam. Over 800 participants took part in that event, and there was over 100 corporate buyers attending the event. So that's the who. Now the why. Why are we acting in this space to accelerate? This one graph from Bloomberg gives you an idea of where the PPA's volumes are in Europe. It is annual volumes, and as you see that currently year to date in 2018, and we now anticipate that it'll be at the end of the year, we'll reach approximately 2 gigawatts of PPAs signed in renewable energy in Europe, primarily in wind. I won't show you the slide for solar, but it's approximately the same, about 2 gigawatts of solar, of C&I, so commercial industrial rooftop solar, has been installed in Europe this year. More interestingly though, what you do note, the PPA volume signed are only really in 4 countries. So again, primarily Norway and Sweden. And our objective is to accelerate the growth of that and diversify it into the other major markets. What's missing there is, of course, France, Germany, UK, Spain, Italy, some of the major markets of energy demand, where the corporates have large energy demand, but currently no PPAs being signed. Our speakers today will cover some of the topics and issues around why that is the case, but our role as the resource platform is to try and address those issues. Just waiting for the next slide. Thank you. One of the things we've done is issue this resource declaration. It's available on our website, on the resource website, which is basically a call to policymakers. And we had over 100 organizations supporting this declaration, asking for the removal of barriers to corporate sourcing, to provide clarity on the guarantees of origin, encourage cross-border transactions, and finally, to enable a wide variety of business models to take off. With those policy recommendations, if they're implemented correctly and ideally in a harmonized way across member states, then we believe we will be able to dramatically accelerate the uptake of renewable energy sourcing and PPAs specifically. Finally, here's a list of the task force that we've initiated within the resource platform. Number one is the policy and lobbying I referenced before on the national energy and climate plans, market design, and the implementation of the recently agreed Renewables Directive. We'll be doing a lot of activity in the member states over the coming 12 months. The second one on simplification and innovation, which is the topic of this conference. This webinar will cover in detail the innovation element. And in fact, Andrew Hedges, who's on the call, is part of this task force, is leading that for us and providing a lot of input on simplification and standardization of transactions. The third is cross-border PPAs to facilitate between member states. And finally, we're looking at heating, cooling, and transport. So I'll stop there and pass on to the next presenter to introduce the acceleration and adoption of PPAs. So over to you, Lucy Hunt, Renewable Energy Associate at WBCSD.
Thank you very much, Bruce. So yes, exactly. As Bruce just said, my name's Lucy Hunt. I'm an associate at WBCSD, and I lead our REscale project, which is the renewable energy project within WBCSD. So today, during this webinar, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to WBCSD, to the REscale project more widely, and most importantly, to the Innovation in PPA Structures report, as the objective of this webinar is, of course, to present the key messages of that report. So just make sure I can move on to the next slide. And it's not working for now, but there we go. Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. So for those of you who haven't come across us before, WBCSD is a global CEO-led organization of 200 businesses, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world by making more sustainable businesses more successful. And we do this in a number of ways. So we have global reach. As I said, we have those 200 members across the globe. We also have over 60 global network partners which engage at a national level. And we provide a unique business platform. So we offer this to businesses so that they can develop solutions to global challenges that they couldn't necessarily have tackled on their own. So we ensure that this is collective action and it's also CEO-led. And we also recognize that it needs to be market-driven. So we consider sustainable development to be a strategic business opportunity. I'm just going to try to move the slide again. And if not, might need solar power to help me out on that.
Yeah, you should have control. Okay, we'll do it for you. Okay. Great.
Thank you very much. So the REscale project is one of WBCSD's main projects. It was set up 3 years ago, and already at that point, we were aware that renewable energy was reliable and increasingly competitive. And so it was recognized that there are a number of actions that the entire renewable energy supply chain could take in order to accelerate that deployment of renewables beyond average growth. So that's the main ambition and action. Next slide, please. And through this REscale project, we've introduced a work stream called the Corporate Renewable PPA Forum. So this is a global forum which is made up of 63 organizations across the entire supply chain. So from renewable developers to buyers to lawyers and investors, right the way to regulators and policymakers. And all of those organizations are working together with the ambition to increase the understanding and use of corporate renewable PPAs across the globe. So we're doing this as part of the forum on a number of activities. We first of all have global topical deep dives. So they're areas that have been identified where more research is needed. So examples there are multi-technology PPAs and cross-border PPAs. But one that we've done before is the innovation in PPAs that we're talking about today. And we also have a number of country deep dives as well. So we've set up PPA forums in India, Argentina, and Brazil. And of course, as well as Bruce has already mentioned, through the resource platform in the EU as well. So WBCSD is one of the 4 founding members of that platform. And in the background of all of this, we're making sure that we're communicating that work effectively. So we're producing a number of deliverables and outputs, and all the way along, we're making sure that they're getting out to that global audience so that we can really achieve that objective that's at the top of that slide. So I put a link there so that you can read a bit more information about it online at your own leisure. Next slide, please. Perfect. And this brings me back round to today then. So this year, the Global PPA Forum has published a report called Innovation in PPA Structures. And the objective of this report has been to help power purchasing companies to overcome challenges and set up innovative, successful renewable PPAs. As you can see there, the target audience is essentially energy procurement teams and sustainability teams, but we recognize that it's actually applicable beyond that to the entire supply chain. So what we've done is we put the link at the end of this webinar and you can download it and read it at your leisure. So that's all from me for now. I'm going to hand over as we have a couple of really great speakers who have both contributed to this report. So they're each going to present the key messages from their own perspectives. And so now I'm going to hand over to Andrew Hedges, partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, who's going to take you through the types, risks, and common approaches to PPAs.
Great, thanks Lucy, and good afternoon everyone who's joined. It's great to see such a big audience of people interested in this topic. Hopefully we'll be able to set it at the right level where we're providing value to the people who are quite expert, but also value to those that are new to the area. It's been very pleasant for us as a firm to have been involved in WBCSD's reports in this area, both the original report that we did on corporate PPAs with the working group, well, I think a few years back now, and also the innovation report that we're discussing today. When we've worked with WBCSD on this, it's not just people such as myself, but we draw from teams across the world, particularly the US, Australia, UK, and across Europe. And for those that are interested in these types of reports, a plug to our Australian team who've just released a similar type of report in the Australian context, looking at corporate PPAs there, covering some of the topics which we'll discuss today. And then also, the way in which we feel that we add value to these reports is to draw on a lot of deal structures and a lot of expertise, and that's informed by consistently being involved in the deals. And we're quite pleased, for example, today for those in the UK that read the Times article regarding the Lightsource BP and AB InBev deal that just got announced, which is innovative in the sense that it's subsidy-free, 100 meg, solar and synthetic. Which has been an exciting deal to be involved with. Now, when we were developing the report with WBCSD and the wider working group that supports each of those reports and draws from developers, buyers, lenders, etc., it was very much about, okay, we want to talk about risk and we want to talk about where innovation is happening or what the market is doing to address risk. But you have to start from the basics. You have to start from, well, what are the main contract types? Because that may influence the views people have or the manner in which you have to deal with different risks. So on this slide, we're covering those two broad types of contracts, the virtual synthetic on one side and the physical structures on the other. And I'm sure many on this webinar are quite familiar with this split, but just to recap again, a virtual or synthetic PPA is a effectively, think of it as a financial product or a financially settled product. So there's not a physical transfer of electricity for the benefit of the ultimate user, the buyer. It's a strike price, for example, that will be settled against a reference price, and that will give the seller revenue certainty and the buyer a clear financial hedge against its energy costs. The buyer would still have to separately go out and purchase energy through its utility. On a physical structure, there is a physical sleeving or wheeling from the developer or owner of the facility through to the buyer. Now that will, in practice, probably involve the buyer working with its utility. And one structure mentioned there is one in some ways a little bit dated in terms of a sort of a back-to-back structure where volumes are sleeved to the benefit of the buyer. But broadly speaking, that's the split. And the critical thing to remember is in a say a physical structure, there will be more aspects to deal with in certain cases that arise from that need to manage the physical flows of power between all of the parties concerned. If I move on to the risks, in the report we covered more risks than the ones that I'll touch on today, but this was some of the ones that we thought would be of interest, of common interest to many of the participants on this call and the audience generally, and then start drilling in a little bit to what the report found in terms of what's developing in the market. So if we break those down, development risk, if you think of corporate PPAs as their primary tool in the market to date, has been really to help greenfield projects get built. That additionality argument, that line that, look, this PPA helped this project get built. And that's fantastic, but that comes with it also that buyers are interested in, well, when is it going to be built by, and what sort of confidence do I have in that? You then get to the operational phase and you start talking about performance. Will this wind farm or solar park operate as we expected it to operate? And the last two there, volume and shape profile, we do split them out, even though they are sort of two sides of a similar coin, in that volume is that broad question of, particularly with intermittent technologies, what are the risks associated with the overall output being less than expected over a period of time? And shape or profile is also about volume, but perhaps it is can be more granular in terms of, it could be what is the hour to hour or more granular levels of time variability depending on the wind or irradiation and how that can be managed. Now, so what we did is we, working both through our own networks, but also the working group that WBCSD pulled together, we did a review of as many different actual deals and players who have a lot of experience in doing deals. What is the kind of approaches that seem to be coming out on a regular basis for these types of different risks? And so what we have on this slide is a little bit of a summary of some of those findings. And we looked at the US, Australia, UK, Netherlands, and India as the primary data points. So on development risk, we did see strong evidence that there is relatively clear target milestone dates for completion, and that there will be consequences after a certain point in time for that being missed. Delay damages after a given buffer period were included in a number of deals across those jurisdictions, less so in the UK, but there's a little bit of history there in long-term PPA practice that explains that. And then Australia was quite noteworthy in terms of it being quite robust on deals done to date, in terms of being relatively strong in terms of what the developer had to deliver on and the consequences if it didn't. If I move to performance, we saw, I've been doing corporate PPAs sadly for 10 plus years. it's only probably really in the last 3 to 4 that capacity or technical capacity or technical availability requirements started appearing in PPAs, and that was seen more widely, that type of expectation was becoming more common, and that could lead to what we call liquidated damages, effectively payments for not meeting it. Now, to make absolutely clear, that is talking about the technical availability. So not turning into a volume guarantee, if you will, for an intermittent technology, just that it will be well run, it will be available, so if the wind does blow or the sun does shine, it can generate. Volume risk, on both volume and shape profile on these, I think this is perhaps the most interesting area. We were seeing evidence in writing the report, which is some time back now, but it's something that I'll be talking to in a couple of slides, because it is where I feel the action is at the moment, particularly in Europe, around what can sellers offer buyers in terms of a more firm product under a PPA. So what we did see for the report was, in markets such as Australia, some expectation of volume, minimum volume commitments, but often perhaps only over, say, a year. So some sort of broad comfort that over a long enough period of time, the facility could generate sufficient volumes to give some sort of comfort, and then less evidence of sort of baseload structured deals to deal with shape or profile risk. So talking on volume risk and innovation around that, one of the topics, we went out there and we looked as part of the group for, well, where are we seeing innovation? What can we point to? And one of the things that our firm had been involved in and had been picking up the pace in recent years, particularly in the US, but has now moved into Australia, and we're seeing it being actively investigated in Europe, is proxy revenue swaps. Now, corporate PPAs provide an element that supports the structure of these, but they're not really purely for corporate PPA solutions. First and foremost, it's about creating a solution that works for a developer or say a large wind farm to support the financing of that wind farm. And it does so by basically taking weather and price risk away from that developer, and in exchange giving it a firm revenue, annual revenue that it can rely upon during the life of the contract. And that it does that by a synthetic, a financially settled structure where the revenue, the firm revenue payable by the proxy revenue swap provider is compared to a proxy revenue. So to take an example, say if there was a low wind year for the wind farm, that would mean that they would receive annually a top up from the proxy revenue swap provider to get them back to what they should have got for that year. And the reference to proxy revenue is that it is that proxy revenue, if you will, is defined on a proxy basis in order to create efficiency. So the revenue that comes into the wind farm in that example is determined by reference to what an efficiently run wind farm would have done for the year in question, and therefore avoiding the perverse outcome that the wind farm developer itself runs it badly and still gets a top up against the firm revenue figure for the year. Now, why corporate PPAs were relevant to that is providers of these products such as Nefila, etc. They can take a strong view on weather risk, but have tended to want to back off the price risk that they're taking on. And say in some of those couple of early deals, Microsoft was effectively taking that price risk by offering a firm price over a 10-year period. Now, if I move on to other forms of volume risk innovation, and I think this is really interesting because it's perhaps what we are seeing in practice regularly in Europe at the moment across deals in Finland and UK, in Spain and elsewhere. There is a lot of work being done to say, how do we offer a corporate buyer an easier product to manage? And effectively being a base load per hour volume that the project will deliver. Now, and that can be under a synthetic basis or a physical basis, but ultimately, if the seller is going to offer that, it needs to work out how it's going to manage the risk of that. It can take that on itself, but at least in our experience, what we're seeing is that developers will tend to want to outsource that to a experienced trader, and they will effectively take that volume that is being generated, that intermittent volume that is being generated by the wind farm, and convert it into a firm product that can be then delivered to the buyer. So it's very interesting and it's good. I think to go back to Bruce's point at the very start, how do we get from a 100 to 100,000? One of those is making it a better product that is less difficult for a corporate buyer or less sophisticated corporate buyers to manage within their overall portfolio of energy needs. And one of the topics we've seen that does bring out is when are the exception events to that baseload commitment? Is there things such as force majeure or other types of events which should relieve the seller from having to continue that baseload commitment? And that becomes very important if they are outsourcing it to a trader or somebody else to manage the overall baseload deliveries, because if that trader is saying that they will not continue to take the risk in the case of FM, someone needs to bear that. It has to be passed on to the buyer or absorbed by the project itself. And clearly, lenders' views on any of that risk allocation is important. And then finally, as Lucy mentioned, one of the things WBCSD is thinking about is looking further at multi-technology PPAs and whether that also is another tool by which volume risk can be managed. And that in the sense of, could you have a portfolio of, say, wind and solar, or could you have a particular technology with battery that somehow creates a physical hedging, if you will, that creates an output that is more capable of managing volume risk. And I think that was my last slide. Just checking. Yes. So I think, Bruce, we were going to have some Q&A at this point before passing on to Margella.
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. Thank you so much for the presentation, and also thank you for your expert input to the resource platform, and specifically on that task force on standardization and simplification, both on the contract side and on this topic of innovation. Extremely valuable. Thank you. A couple of questions have come up from the audience. Do remember you can use the question function in the control panel. Please type your questions in there during the presentation, and we'll take a selection at the end. One quick one is, will you get slides after the presentation? Yes, we will circulate the full slide deck and a link to the full report to all participants after the webinar. Yeah. Second question, more technical and specifically to you, Andrew, is on cannibalization risk. Could you tell us a bit about that and what work has been done on it, and what your experience of that is?
Sure. Well, perhaps more of a question for a market analyst than a lawyer. As I understand, cannibalization risk is the risk that increasing market share for renewables undermines long-term price certainty. Is that your understanding as well, Bruce?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily seeing specific solutions within contracts to address that. It falls within that wider question of price risk, and traditional corporate PPAs for accounting reasons have tended to be fixed price or fixed with indexation, inflation indexation. So relatively simple pricing structures. We have heard more innovation in the US market around caps and floors, and providing greater sort of price openers or means to rebalance PPAs in the case of significant shifts in market prices, but that has to be limited to the extent that it can address lenders' needs to see at least some sort of minimum long-term revenue for the project under a given PPA.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I'll come to Mariella in a moment on that. We'll take a couple more questions, and then before handing over to her for her presentation, I'll see if she's got any comments on the questions we're receiving. The next one though is more directed at your presentation, and specifically the proxy revenue swap that you elaborated on. And the question is, how is that different from a clever insurance policy? And I assume they're referencing possibly the Microsoft, the volume firming agreements that they have initiated, where there is insurance on to cover weather risk. But I mean, just on that, how is it different from a clever insurance policy?
Well, I think it is an insurance policy in a way. It's just been structured in that manner because that's how it delivered on the needs of those projects. And I think proxy revenue swaps can continue in broadly the form they've been structured before, or you will see perhaps, as mentioned, more nuanced products which can address one piece of the puzzle. So you could have weather insurance, which addresses that, and then a more flexible approach to actual sales of power and the price you receive for that. I know, for instance, Munich Re is definitely was at your event and was very much focused on the sort of insurance-based solutions for projects.
Yeah, good. Okay, and then one which I think I could probably answer myself, but just to get your view on it, is these risks and solutions, are they applicable for wind, or also for solar? And maybe elaborate, and maybe I'll go a bit further on that question and say, okay, what are the differences, and there are some subtle and not so subtle differences between the PPAs signed for wind and solar projects, and what are you seeing there, and maybe reference some of the risks you identified?
Broadly, I would say at a macro level, that's the topics we covered, like around development risk, technical availability, etc. It would be pretty consistent between solar and wind, that those topics need to be dealt with. The actual terms of, for example, how you approach availability risk or the determination of that is clearly different. Beyond that, I guess there is, Bruce, you might have your own views as well, that the seasonality of solar perhaps gives a certain degree of broad annual predictability that may be less so for wind, but I could be convinced otherwise on that.
On that, would you see clauses required in contracts to hedge out that? I mean, it's not so much a risk as you say, it's almost predictable seasonal variation.
Well, I think it's I've seen it relevant when buyers who are accepting a sort of as produced type of PPA, so not requiring a baseload or firmed product, considering that seasonality and it being accounted for when they work, say, in a physical structure with a utility provider, in the fees they'll pay to have those solar volumes sleeved into their wider energy profile. So I've seen that, not necessarily specific provisions perhaps, but more that it's been accounted for in terms of the costs of the PPA.
Yeah, okay, good. And then quickly on the physical versus financial discussion, and we're seeing the majority of PPAs being signed in Europe being physical sleeve PPAs, and a lot in the US being synthetic financial. We as the resource platform see an opportunity to increase the volumes of PPAs being signed by increasing the number of synthetic or financial PPAs. What's your view on that?
I'm a bit of a convert. I was a bit hesitant on synthetic, but having I think I've come around. My understanding, and I'm a lawyer, so please, for the people listening and the recording in the future, if anyone listens to this, not an accountant. It's my understanding in the US, under US GAAP, entering into a synthetic PPA does not tend to, or at least on an as-produced basis, does not tend to trigger derivative accounting on the part of the buyer, and so it's a lot easier for buyers to take on a synthetic PPA structure. My understanding in Europe under IFRS that may not be the case, and so to date there's been a reticence. Companies just don't seem to like derivative accounting because of the potential impact on P&L statements. So putting that into a box of we need to solve for accounting, if we assume we can solve for that or everyone's happy with that, from a legal perspective, I think that once you analyze the financial services regulation aspects, synthetic PPA can be done efficiently and probably provides more capacity to be the basis of standardization in Europe in different markets, because it's less driven by the physical dynamics of the particular energy regulatory structure in a given country.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I mean, our understanding is, we can overcome those accountancy issues and facilitate more financial PPAs in Europe. It's not necessarily the topic of this webinar, so let's not dig into that anymore. It's certainly something the resource platform will be covering in future, though, possibly in an own dedicated webinar in future. Just to wrap up then, I'll give you one last question, and maybe sort of a bit future looking, and also on the topic of accelerating PPAs in the European market. What's your take on that? What's your take on the PPA market in 2019 and on the acceleration that we're seeing or not seeing?
I think it's definitely picking up. It often felt over the last 5 years that it was really just the UK and Scandinavia. The UK has been in a bit of a hiatus, but is now coming around because the price point between sellers and buyers is working. Scandinavia, it continues to be strong. We've got last count 4 deals going on in Scandinavian countries at the moment, all new deals, and it seems to be really picking up, particularly places like Finland. Spain is also picking up. Everyone involved, I think, in the market is seeing a lot of activity in Spain. And then even places which have traditionally been seen as almost impossible, France and Germany will I think see real developments in 2019. So I would be very positive about the number of deals in 2019, but would still say as well that wider challenge that you've put out there of 100 to 100,000 still stands. Each of the deals is fantastic, but can take time to negotiate, particularly if it's a 10 or 15-year deal. So we need to make it easier for everyone to do more.
Very good. Good to end on an optimistic note. Thank you, Andrew. And also, we would agree with you that not only in terms of markets, we see some deals being signed in France, Germany, certainly an explosion in Spain, but also in terms of the sectors. So energy intensives are getting more and more into the market, not just the traditional Norsk hydro metal side, but also chemicals. And the push, the 100 to 100K, although at first view seems ambitious, we are convinced that with the measures that you mentioned and with some awareness raising of the low cost, the cost competitiveness of renewables, that we can drive that. And in the coming years, we'll see a large uptake in renewable sourcing. Andrew, thanks a lot for your time. Do hang on if you can, because we'll try to come back to you at the end for some Q&A. But right now, I have the pleasure of moving on to our next presenter, who is Marielle de Vries from Rabobank, who will give a lender's view of corporate PPAs. And Marielle, just before you start your presentation, if you want to touch any of the questions or comments, or even the presentation that Andrew made, now's your chance, okay? And then over to you, Marielle. You should have control of the slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I heard some interesting questions. Great. Well, yeah, my name is Marielle de Vries. I'm working for Rabobank in the project finance department. And yeah, I will present a lender's perspective on corporate PPAs. Before we kick off, just a few words on our experiences so far with corporate PPAs. Up to now, we have closed 6 corporate PPA transactions, of which 5 were in the Nordics. Our first transaction was closed in 2016, and since then, I must say, we have seen the PPA structures evolving rapidly. We started with the as-produced PPA structures, but this year, I must say, I have also seen blended PPA structures with as-produced characteristics as well as baseload characteristics. So yeah, it's what's already covered in the previous presentations. It's really evolving, and I think yeah, that's very positive. And it will keep on evolving with more appetite for corporate PPAs. Okay.
You just need to click. You need to click once, and then you'll got control, Mariella. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I'll give it a few seconds. Not sure. Just struggling a bit with moving to the next slide. Ah, great. Was that me moving to the next slide?
It was, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Well, on this slide, the key characteristics of a typical project finance are shown. I find this slide useful because it explains to a large extent why in project finance structures more control and information governance are required, and why the fundamental contracts are heavily scrutinized. Just to demonstrate a bit the process, from a lender's perspective, banks are invited by the developers or investors at some point to discuss the financing of a project, and at that point there are no assets yet. The whole project still needs to be developed, and all key contracts, including the PPA, need to be negotiated. And we will, in the end, bank on the promise of the future cash flows, and to predict these cash flows, the fixing of power prices is key. And that's why we pay a very close look to the PPA. And in our view, a PPA needs to tick certain boxes. But what is a PPA that ticks all the boxes from a lender's perspective? But to answer this question, it's key to realize that the PPA is really considered the backbone of the financing, because banks seek to have certainty of revenues and therefore require long-term predictable cash flows with only a limited level of merchant risk. Well, in my next slide, I will cover the main bankability considerations for corporate PPAs. And I will start just with a high-level classification of the type of PPAs that we have seen so far. Generally speaking, we classify corporate PPAs along 2 axes. One is price and the other one is volume. Starting off with volume, you have either a fixed volume in the contracts or a floating, or said differently, you have an as-produced PPA, which is a floating volume in our view, or a baseload PPA, which is a fixed volume. And then, in terms of price, it can either be fixed or floating. And in particular, floating price PPAs, that are PPAs which usually need to mirror a subsidy scheme. So, that's something which you have seen in the last couple of years, but that's something which, going forward, will not be seen so often anymore. And if you wonder which type of PPAs is preferred from a lender's perspective, this is certainly the as-produced one, because this will push the profiling risk, which is already discussed in Andrew's presentation, to the off-taker. And I will just come back to that a bit later. Good. Well, what happens? Can I move to the next slide? Sorry, I thought I had control, but that was not the case anymore. Okay. So, well, how do we assess a PPA? Well, we normally start with well, the tenor and the counterparty. And if we well, think about the tenor, well, lenders will generally want to see long-term PPAs that match the term of the loan agreement and preferably include a tail period after the scheduled maturity of the loan. That said, I must admit that we see some changes happening here in terms of investors asking lenders to structure the loan agreement without any positive tail or even with a negative tail. And whether this is acceptable, well, very much depends on either of well, the whole package actually, so on all the features of the deal. But as a starting point, I always say, well, let's have a PPA that closely matches the financing term. And then we have the counterparty risk. As you might have experienced, perhaps when negotiating contractual terms of a PPA with a bank, the credit strength of a corporate off-taker is always a key topic. We heavily scrutinize the credit strength of a counterparty because this party will need to give the comfort to lenders and obviously also to the project that they will be there for the full term of the financing to buy the power. And just, well, to make a comparison, well, if from a lender's perspective, in project finance, we're used to lend long term, but we're not used to lend long term on just a corporate, because then it's just, well, normally 5-year financing. So, well, now that we're moving to financing structures with, well, indirect exposure to a corporate for, well, 10 to 20 years, that's just, well, something new, and well, we have become comfortable with it, but it's just we needed to take a different view on it. I guess, well, related to, well, this counterparty risk is also what a level of credit support. If we're not, well, fully comfortable with the credit rating or financial capability of the direct counterparty, we in general ask for credit support, and this can be in the form of a parent company guarantee, a letter of credit, or some other kind of credit support. And if you're, well, wondering what the level of credit support should be, well, in our view, this should reflect the market-to-market value between a replacement offtake and the agreed fixed price. So if you end up in a termination scenario that at least, well, the debt that was sized on the volume or the price and volume that resulted in a certain debt amount, that could at that point be repaid. Can we move to the next one, please? Thank you. Well, then obviously tenor, I've discussed counterparty. Then another, well, important point which becomes more and more important is, well, volume and profile risk. So volume risks, which volume will be locked in with the PPA on the one hand, and will there be a fixed volume agreed with an off-taker? I admit that, well, volume risk and profile slash shape risk are very interrelated, but, well, to perhaps repeat what Andrew already said, with volume risk, we often consider the risk that a fixed volume is not met over a longer period, whereas with profile risk, we refer to an hourly obligation that needs to be fulfilled. And especially with intermittent technologies such as wind or solar, the profile risk is difficult to forecast. And as such, it also poses an additional risk on a project if it's borne by the project. So in general, we can get comfortable with volume risk if at least, it's a fixed volume on a yearly basis and is only for a certain percentage of the P50 output. But we're more reluctant to take profile risk, and actually only profile risk can be taken if prices remain flat during longer periods. And I guess that's that's the issue. I already heard the question on cannibalization. That's indeed what makes it more difficult for banks to accept profile risk, because what we are seeing happening with the whole build out of renewables is that there can be a significant impact on the prices in certain periods, and obviously this very much depends on the jurisdiction you're in, but overall there will be an impact, and it's difficult to predict. And just coming back to my earlier remark, this is also why I said in the beginning that as produced PPAs for the larger part of the production volume have our preference. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. On this slide, I have listed the main bankability considerations with some explanation to it as well. I believe most of it we covered, but if there are some particular questions on the ones that are not discussed, I'm happy to take those. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Good. Mariella, thanks very much for the presentation. We do have some questions, actually. I mean, before I go into the questions that we've received for you, do you have any comments or answers to the questions that Andrew received earlier?
Well, I was a bit triggered by the cannibalization, because that's the question that we also have, and that's we don't have the answer, but it's that's one of the points that we're struggling with. On the one hand, we see the profiling risk being pushed to the developers, and indirectly then also to the lenders, because off-takers do not feel themselves well positioned to manage that risk. And I guess that's true, or it's true if you're not a utility. But on the other hand, if you're just a developer and have a single project, you're also not that well positioned. So yeah, we've been talking to some utility people, or some people were telling me, perhaps obviously now they're like prices are set on an hourly basis. Perhaps this will move to a daily basis. It also just depends on the whole setup of the energy markets. But those, I guess that's then the cannibalization effect will at least be flattened out over the day. So I don't have the answer. So if there are people actually that know more about it, I'm very interested. But we definitely see this as one of the bigger issues, and that's why you can't really take or at least what we see is that we're just more conservative with the depth amounts that we can structure on projects. And this indirectly leads to higher equity contributions.
Okay, good. Thanks for taking that question. In the last couple of minutes that we've got, I'll take some specific questions to you. One is on blended PPA structures. Yeah, you talked about pairs produced and baseload characteristics. What do you see usually in those blended PPA structures?
Well, yeah, I was referring to to deals we have closed this year in the Nordics. It's exactly as I say. It's there is part of the P50 volume is locked in under a baseload structure, and on top of that there is an as produced structure, and that's the two together do not add up to 100%, but it's for the major part of the P50 output, and in such a way it's you obviously under a baseload you have this hour to hourly obligation, which if you lock in, for example, 70%, we heard that at least for wind projects, it's you probably in 50% of the cases you actually don't meet this exact volume, so then you need to buy it on spot, and then you're exposed again to the spot price, which can be high in low wind periods and high during vice versa. So what we did is we had what is base load on a rather low level, and then we topped it up with an as produced. But that are structures which are not it really depends on the party providing it, because you need to do it actually with one party, and otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay. Then on to credit support. There's a question here: is the credit support required dynamic? And so, in other words, would it change with increasing MTM gains and losses? I assume they mean mark-to-market gains or losses. And so, would that require the corporate buyer to put up cash?
Yeah. You mean margin? No. Normally, what we do is we just in the context that we have seen is that there's a declining credit support necessary, but it's just an estimate. So up front we determine this should be the maximum market to market, and we expect this to decrease in the course of time.
Okay.
So
good.
It's not dynamic.
Yeah. Thank you. Before I ask you the one last question, Andrew, do you have any comments or answers to some of those things you've heard, or to Mariella's presentation?
No, in the interest of time, just on that last one, I'd agree that we don't see margining or dynamic credit support requirements. In my understanding, in the US, on most of those deals, they don't have that either.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry.
Please.
Go ahead, Bruce. Well, it's sometimes you obviously see that credit support is mirrored, so it should be also on the project, and then margining is just impossible when you're talking about a project finance, because that's exactly the issue. You don't have additional cash to just increase or have a dynamic credit support. So no.
Okay, thanks. And one very last question to you, Mariella. It's a business strategy question from someone. So clearly there's going to be winners and losers on both sides as we go forward in the PPA growth. On the seller's side specifically, I wouldn't say, the question doesn't ask who will be the winners and losers, it more asks what are the keys to be winners as an energy seller?
Oh, that's a tricky one.
Put you on the spot for the last question.
Yeah. But you're asking it to a lender, right? So and you sellers, you mean the developers? Yeah,
the developers, exactly, the clean energy suppliers.
Yeah, I guess because I guess there's more demand for PPAs than there is supply. So I guess if you as a developer want to take more risks, so that means if you want to take the profiling risk, and if you can find parties willing to finance that, that's the way actually to secure a PPA.
Good, thanks. And Andrew, one word on that? How do you win? patience.
Yes.
Patience.
It's as fast as you want to move. You have to remember that for many corporates, this will be a very big deal for them and a new type of deal.
Yeah. Okay, good. So we're going to wrap up there. First of all, I'd like to thank you both very much, and Lucy, for your contribution to this webinar. Fascinating stuff. We're going to do many more of these webinars in the future. And although we didn't manage to address all those questions that we have listed here, please do submit them to Resource Platform website, and we'll do our best to respond to those. As I said earlier, we'll be circulating the slides with a link to the detailed innovation report in the next day or two. And finally, just to tell you of our the next activities that Resource is organizing. There's a webinar to be held on the 16th of January on on-site renewables, so corporate sourcing from on-site, the rooftop or on-site. Please do join us for that, and in the meantime, have a great holiday, and speak to you and see you all in January. Thank you very much.